Good evening, everyone. My name is Maggie, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual event tonight with that being Chen in conversation with Jiayang Fan, discussing Land of Big Numbers stories. We're so excited and grateful that our bookstore can continue to bring authors and their works to our community during this time. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn about them on our website, booksoup.com, as well as our social media at BookSoup. Our next event is tomorrow, Tuesday, February 10th at 6 p.m. with Richard Thompson Ford in conversation with Ariella Gross discussing dress codes, how the laws of fashion made history. Just so you know, during this event, Jiayang is having a little glitch with her computer, with her handheld. And we've tried to fix it. She'll come back on screen. Don't worry if she disappears for a second. She's back on screen. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future. For regular updates on our upcoming events, please feel free to subscribe to our email newsletter, which you can do on our website. To submit a question during the event, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on your list that you'd like our speakers to answer, please click the like button. We'll answer as many questions as time will allow. Please do not use the sidebar chat to ask a question. Also, support our local bookstore and our authors by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book. To do that, just click on the green purchase button directly below your viewer screen. The link will redirect you to our website where we can continue our checkout process. We're selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro FM and Kobo for those who are interested. A little more about Deping Chen. Deping's fiction has been published in or is forthcoming from The New Yorker, Granta, Guernica, Tin House, and The Atlantic. A reporter for the Wall Street Journal, she was previously a correspondent for the paper in Beijing and Hong Kong. Prior to joining the Journal in 2012, she spent a year in China as a Fulbright Fellow. A little bit more about Jiayang Fan. Jiayang became a staff writer at The New Yorker in 2016. Her reporting in China, American politics, and culture has appeared in the magazine and on NewYorker.com since 2010. She is currently working on her first book, Motherland, which will be published by Farrar, Straus & Giroux in 2023. And without further ado, I'm going to turn my camera off and hand you over to Deping and Jiayang. Jiayang, sorry. Jiayang. Enjoy the presentation. Remember, there's a glitch with the screen, and don't worry about it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that intro. Yes, I will be playing a little bit of hide and seek with you all, not through involuntarily, but know that I am here and that chances are I will come back. I'm really happy to be doing this event. This is a book that I've looked forward to for a long time now, and I have read Deping's fiction and nonfiction. I mean, starting with her reporting in the Journal, and she is someone I have followed and whose voice I've always been very interested in. And reading her stories, first of all, made me feel like I was being incredibly lazy. I don't know how she finds the time to be able to craft these masterful stories in addition to reporting, but also made me re-examine, my relationship to China and the way that I conceive of writing. In so many ways, as a long form journalist, most of my pieces about China are not timely reactions. They're usually reflections on something that's been going on in China for a while. I know that things in China are happening at such a vertiginous pace, and that changes are being made in both in scope and on a scale that is, really unimaginable for many of us here living in the U.S. And what I found very, magical about the stories in Land of Big Numbers is the way that they're able to capture that fable-like feel of China, because everything is happening at this, head-spinning pace. It feels like it's something between realism and surrealism. And my first question to you is how, when you were writing these stories, did it start with a single character or an incident, or were you conceiving of them as fables that were meant to capture more than just, one incident or one person?
Yeah, I think. Oh wow, there's an echo. Or am I the only one hearing that?
No. Okay, I think it's gone.
If the application's open in another screen, it'll cause that. But it seems to be gone, so just make sure that all the other tabs are closed.
Okay. I think they are.
That was probably on me.
Got it.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for being here, Jiayang. I think I speak for many people in this audience when I just say how much I admire your reporting and your writing. And also wanted to thank HMH for publishing this book and for all of the readers and really kind reviewers who've been so supportive and wonderful in the week that it's been out. And thank you everyone for being here. I really loved what you said about the pace of change in China and what it means in terms of how it feels to live there and the experience of being in modern China today and the surrealism. I sometimes think of what Yu Hua said about how Westerners would have to live 4 centuries to try and encompass what people in China have experienced in the past 4 decades. And so I think in conceptualizing Land of Big Numbers, of course, there absolutely is magical realism in the way some of these stories were crafted. And for me, I mean, it was, in some ways, I mean, it really didn't, it felt like it wasn't even a choice. It felt like, I guess, if anything, it was just the best way to sort of try and evoke the experience of living in modern China today. I mean, it is a place so much that, living there day to day, you're struck by these extraordinary details that feel like they're straight out of Garcia Marquez. I'm thinking of the weather modification programs that the government has. On smoggy days, you just wait for the government to fire up its cloud seeding devices and make it rain and wash all the pollution away. Or when I was living in the country too, I remember one corruption case when a government official had embezzled so much money, these just storerooms of it, they needed 16 cash counting machines and 4 of them burned out in the process. Just every day felt like you were encountering so many of these details that were vivid or arresting. And many, of course, which made their way into the book. Some of the details that seem most fabulous, like funeral strippers, for example, which is one of my favorite stories in the book. Flying Machine was very much taken from real life. The phenomenon in more frequently in rural China, when someone passes away and you want to ensure good turnout at their funeral, and one way to do so is to hire, nighttime entertainment, maybe a little body, but invite a stripper and ensure a crowd. And so I think in writing these stories and those, thinking about those sorts of details and characters, I mean, in many ways it was just, I think, an outcome of kind of trying to capture reality in China, right? And the sort of details and the sort of the surprises inherent in life there, and just trying to capture that for readers.
Yeah, I mean, you do that so beautifully and so seamlessly. And reading your stories, it really made me reflect on the way that I report on China. And sometimes I'm often caught between the impulse to capture China and to explain China for my readers.
Right.
Explaining phenomenon like the funeral strippers, which doesn't make intuitive sense. Just saying those things to like a Western audience, yes, there are strippers at a funeral. That definitely requires, at least as a journalist, a few paragraphs to explain kind of what's happening, and then to take a step back and to examine what is happening and how should we look at what's happening. I often find myself caught between just setting up the reality of this world and then, in the way that US journalists, examine what's happening domestically, then trying to, hopefully in not too heavy-handed a way to, ask the question, well, what should we make of this? Is this something that we want to see happening? Is this a direction that we want to go into? And in my reporting as a China correspondent, I often am conflicted about how much setup I should do versus how much versus whether it's my place to really cast judgment, especially as a Chinese American, when I feel like my identity is already torn, and there's that question of is any kind of judgment I pass going to be seen as a reflection on my allegiance to either China or the U.S.? And I know that for you, as a Chinese American, that must, that you are subjected to that similar kind of judgment. I mean, the stories, I feel, they beautifully walk that line of presenting the world of China to someone who both knows China very well and to someone who knows nothing about China. But do you feel like you have to? But how did you wrestle, I guess, with walking that line between presenting and kind of evaluating this other world?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a journalist, you spend so much time thinking about what audiences know and don't know, and you always have that internal monologue in your ear, right, as you write. And so, yeah, if I was writing about noodle making robots, which appear in the book, in the context of a news article, which I did actually, I wrote a news story about that. You would explain the role of technology in modern China and these phenomenon of labor-saving devices and why we need to save labor and therefore why we have these robots that make noodles. Whereas in fiction, I love that you could just bring it in as a matter of course, and you don't need to explain it. It's part of the world, and so you don't have to constantly be accommodating or apologizing to the reader. And so, I think for me, so much of writing fiction is just having license to create a world that exists on its own and it's not subject to all these sorts of having to first run a gauntlet of preconceived ideas about China, and will this make sense, does this parse? It's really just trying to evoke a place and transport a reader. And I think also in some ways, I mean, journalism, I think we are handing a lot to the reader, and in some ways I feel like with fiction you're asking more of the reader, you're asking them to rise to the occasion, to have the sense of imagination, right? And to be transported and see themselves in the place of an elderly farmer who wants to build an airplane. I'm thinking of one character in the book, or a young man who's speculating the stock market. Another character that readers encounter. And just, these are all sort of like transfigurative acts that I think we ask of readers, asking them to come to the table and not need the same sort of hand-holding, because at the end of the day, so much of the experience of reading is really about empathy and trying to insert yourself in other people's worlds, not asking them to be created for you or explained for you in a more didactic way.
Yeah, I think that is, I mean, I appreciated that, the kind of the freedom to be plopped into the world and not having too much didactic contextualization. I wondered for you, I mean, there must be many listeners here who who are aspiring writers, or who are just curious about how one begins on this path of being a writer. And I think some of them might have might want to be a journalist. Others might have fiction writing aspirations. Can you tell us a little bit about your path? How through journalism and into fiction, and kind of what the major stops were along the way?
Sure. So growing up, I was just a reader and loved books above anything else, and spent a lot of time writing too, fiction and poetry as a kid, and just never thought it was something that you could do as a job, really. And it was only in college when I started realizing that there was this occupation that existed, journalism, and I started freelancing for the local weekly, and it seemed like this almost miraculous thing that you could be a journalist and have this job that allowed you to ask questions of anyone and to exercise your curiosity in this way. And the job just seemed like this really miraculous passport. And so I started in local alt weeklies, writing about prisons and cops, and this coincided with the period. This was college, and although I'd been someone who had loved fiction all my life up to that point, I went through a period of wanting to be like a very serious person and read, and I was surrounded by brilliant people who wanted to change the world, and so I also wanted to be like a brilliant person with intelligent thoughts on things, and so I read a lot of history and politics and philosophy, and it really was only after graduating and starting to work in journalism for the first time that I felt almost a sense of like loneliness, that really it was returning to fiction that I felt like I craved that, and ultimately came back to it at that point, both the reading and the writing of it. And for years, it was just like this really private thing that sustained me. It was something that I did on the side, or would read in the mornings, write in the mornings before going into work. And it's something that I kept doing for years and years. I wrote my first novel when I was living in Chengdu. It was just, it lives on a hard drive somewhere. And yeah, it was something, again, that just, it wasn't something that I thought could be a part of my professional life. And I kept it like very, very separate. And it was, but it did sustain me. And it was only when I was living in Beijing as a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal that I picked up that novel again. I was wrestling with it, and I was stuck. It was this historical novel set in like 1930s Shanghai, and I was just finding that some of the inspiration had run aground, and I was trying so hard to conjure up this fictional universe set decades and decades ago. And at some point, I just realized, well, I'm surrounded by so much and a world that I know, and I could be writing about that. And one day I was biking home from work from the bureau in Beijing, and I had this phrase, Shanghai murmur, pop into my head. And I decided I would try and write a short story around it. I've always been an admirer of short stories, but I hadn't written any. And I ended up writing 10, which is this book. And for me, it really was just like this incredible feeling of liberation to get to write in this different genre. Obviously, I'd spent so much time as a reporter in China trying to tell stories about this really complicated place, and sort of by necessity only ever capturing the world in these narrow 800-word slices. And as you know very well, like so much of the time, journalism is preoccupied with kind of the grand scale of like state policy and US-China relations. And it's really easy to feel like you lose, you don't get to see that intimate and so much of what I felt moved by in China was the everyday and some of the humor and beauty and the individual stories, really. And so that's what I felt so much driving the process of writing these short stories, and why I think ultimately, like, once I started to write them, I became unstuck, because it was just, I had spent so much time in the country, both as a reporter and also before that as a student, trying to absorb and understand and kind of wrestle with the place. And once I started to write, there was just like this feeling of tremendous urgency to try and just capture it and get it all down.
Yeah. Yeah. I again admire the way that in a way you made such efficient use of your time in China to both be doing your day job, but also be capturing these characters in a much more vivid light. And what I felt most deeply reading these stories were that they were so different from the cardboard cutouts that you sometimes by necessity can only read in a newspaper story. That these were people who felt soulful, who felt conflicted and ambivalent and cowardly or dignified. And I wonder if in the process of constructing these characters, did you feel like you were living with them, or did they feel like people kind of that you encountered in the past that you were trying to get into? I mean, what was it? I mean, I know that fiction writers always in some way live with these characters, but what was the kind of the nature of your cohabitation with these characters?
It's a good question. I think so many of the characters that readers meet in this book were seeded mostly, I mean, bits and pieces of them were drawn from the texture of life around me. I'm thinking of one story in the book, New Fruit, which is very much, yeah, it's sort of a tribute to the neighborhood where I lived in Beijing, like an old Hutong neighborhood, where there's this fruit that comes into the market one day and it transforms the neighborhood, has these supernatural properties. And that was when I was thinking very much of my neighbors and sort of the older retirees that would throng the Hutongs and sit around and gossip. And I could hear their voices very clearly in my head. And they were the ones that I was just surrounded with day to day. And others, they were more plucked from headlines around me that I would take almost as like writing prompts. I'm thinking of the story Flying Machine, when readers meet this elderly farmer who wants to build an airplane, even though he's never flown. And that was from the category of stories that I would encounter often, early morning in the bureau, flipping through local media and just seeing these headlines come up and always just being fascinated. Like, these stories just felt so rich, and they weren't quite news stories maybe for us, but they were obviously stories. And I just found myself really wanting to hear these stories and know who these people were and try and channel them a little bit. And so, yeah, many of the stories had those sort of fictional seeds in headlines as well. So yeah, I think it was really a mix of both my own personal life and also just the fabric and texture of being a reporter in China, when you're constantly just seeing little snippets and glimpses of things, and sometimes wanting to chase and not always being able to. And so for me, it was, yeah, just following some of those threads.
One of my favorite stories in the collection is the first one, Lulu. I just found it enormously compelling. I read it several times, and it, in some ways, at once it felt, the characters, it's a pair of twins who live very different, lives, and without spoiling it, one is a very successful student who becomes a political dissident, and the narrator of the story is the brother who plays lots of video games and kind of watches his sister, his sister's life go on this meandering path. The story felt very true to my understanding of China and to some of the characters that I have met in China. And I found myself discussing this story with with fellow Chinese American friends who also felt it to really kind of capture China in this, beyond nonfiction reporting. And we couldn't decide. I mean, we were trying to decide if it was a pessimistic or optimistic vision of China. And this question actually just popped into my head as you were talking about kind of meeting these characters in either in reporting trips or these story ideas in your neighborhood. So I think I might be catching you off guard a little bit, but do you think of them either as optimistic or a pessimistic kind of portrayal of China, or is it not even? Where is that really irrelevant?
It's not one that I was thinking about with regard when I was writing it, but in stepping back and looking at the collection, it's something that I have thought a fair bit about. And ultimately, what I come back to is this feeling that when you look at a narrative or a country or a government, a place at a grand scale, it's really easy to feel sad and dark about it. And I think that's something that many of us here in the US are feeling right now, that when you look at that level, it's easy to feel that things are inhuman or to lose hope in some ways. And what strikes me in China, that when is, living there, I had that same sensation, right? When you look at the broader script, it is easy to feel dark and perhaps pessimistic. But I think when you really focus and pay attention to the individual and the particular and the idiosyncratic, and you think of the people in your day-to-day life and the ones who so animate and inspire you. And for me, that was really so much of the experience of living in China, which is constantly being so astounded by the people who I would meet, like just the creativity, the incredible like ambition, and yet married to this like matter of fact pragmatism, and yeah, wild creativity that I just so admired. And I think people, a country that has many people like Lulu, in a more overt ways and less so, but I mean, people who very much are not taking the script as handed to them, people who have their own ways of seeing the world. And it's for me, in some ways, fiction, just in getting to focus on the particular like that, really just inherently is an act for me that's about hope. And I think that says a lot about, I think, also just how I see people. Is I think when you see us at that level, it is ultimately a hopeful thing. When we see China as the communist paradigm, we think about it at that monolithic scale, which I think so often many of us do from the headlines. Of course, it's easy to feel dark and not optimistic. But when we look at the human, which is so much what Land of Big Numbers is trying to evoke, I think you do have a different response.
Mm-hmm.
I hope.
No, I think that's certainly that's certainly true, because these stories are so grounded in individual characters, and you feel that, and you feel these characters so deeply as you are going through.
Yeah, and I think we see that in the U.S. too, right? Like on a national scale, we might look at all of the tensions that we see, but then if you look in your own neighborhood and you see like acts of individual kindness and those sorts of connections, I think it's very much the same in China too, or it can be.
I think for so many readers, and perhaps there are a number of Chinese Americans here. I remember as a child and even as an adult being particularly excited by Chinese American writers who I just felt so much. Even when they were strangers, it felt like they knew me so much more intimately, and that perhaps I felt connected to them because they were, well, first of all, they were doing the thing that I wanted to do as a kid, to write, but also that they knew something about the duality of existence of being both Chinese and American. And for you and for me, I guess, growing up in the States, speaking Chinese, and then returning to China to be a reporter, it is a journey that feels very, that probably is unfamiliar to the vast majority of people, but feels very familiar, I think, to Chinese Americans. Can you talk a little bit about how in writing this book, who are you writing it for, and is it is it for Americans? Is it for Chinese people in China? Is it for Chinese Americans? I mean, obviously it's for everyone, but does the identity of your audience ever figure into the writing process, or figure into how you construct the story?
Yeah, my experience, first of all, was I think much like yours in that way. I mean, I felt like when I did find books that felt like they were about a country that meant a lot to me and my family growing up, it was just, yeah, it was wonderful and revelatory and limited, of course, because so many of the books I felt like I read growing up. I mean, it was essentially like, I guess it was like Joy Luck Club and like The Good Earth and Wild Swans, and like history, kind of like fictional history ended like maybe at the Cultural Revolution, and like nothing after that. And so, yeah, I mean, I felt very much those gaps. And as far as who the book is intended for, I mean, it's been really surprising and wonderful and so gratifying. I mean, even though the book's just been out for a week, like to have gotten so many notes from readers from, in the States, but also in mainland China and in Hong Kong, just saying like what you wrote meant so much to me. It felt truthful. That's been incredible to see. And I was really, at the end of the day, I was writing the stories for myself. I mean, journalism, I spend all my days professionally, thinking about other people and trying to write for a much more, for a clear sense of audience. And part of what is so liberating in fiction is just getting to write with some of those, in some ways, I don't want to say censors, but with some of those guardrails off. And I think sometimes of that piece of writing advice from Jeff Dyer, he says, have regrets, they are fuel. On a page, they flame into desire. I'm probably butchering it. It's something that I found. To be honest, I don't entirely know what he means, but the way I interpret it is, I think it feels relevant to the writing of Land of Big Numbers, because for me, I think I really had just spent so much time in the country trying to absorb it and being so struck by the details of what I saw around me, and also being possessed of this terrifying, this feeling of fear that I was just not capturing it or doing it justice, and wanting so badly to capture it on page and to try and yeah, in some ways just save what I was seeing. I don't know. I don't even know how to express it. But I guess the answer to your question is I was writing the stories ultimately for myself, but it has been really extraordinary to see the kind of resonance that I think it has had for some readers in different places, both here as well as in China, which, going off of a little bit of, I think, what you were looking at before, just I think part of what feels important to me with this book and more broadly is just enlarging our idea of a China story, right? And I think so often, again, as we mentioned before, there's like this idea of China being a monolith, and there's like one China story. And part of what was so wonderful with Clubhouse was getting to see the diversity of voices that exist. And so, yeah, I mean, that's something that readers get through this book too.
The last story in your collection, and again, I won't spoil too much, but it deals with the protagonist who finds himself stuck in a train station for much longer than they were intending to. And of course, I couldn't help but think about the pandemic and how we are stuck in our homes for much longer than we ever thought possible last March, and how we are all individually dealing with that sense of stuckness. I think I've read that you wrote the story before the pandemic, but it has become startlingly, relevant to to this moment we are living. I'm wondering how has the pandemic, changed your writing process or your writing ritual, and is the pandemic something that you're interested, in writing about now that since it's such a kind of unusual moment, and unusual moments, it's typically such fodder for fiction writers.
It's so funny. It's not something that occurred to me at all until, of course, recent events. But so for people who haven't read the story yet, it's about a group of commuters. Yes, as Jiayang mentioned, they get stuck underground and they end up constructing this whole other society and life for themselves. And it does feel eerily similar a bit to what we're experiencing today, just how quickly circumstances can change, and also likewise how quickly we can acclimate ourselves. The pandemic, of course, has made everything harder. I'm still working as a journalist, and I'm still writing fiction, and more even, I think, than the pandemic is probably the bigger change in some ways in my life circumstances. Since I wrote Land of Big Numbers, I've since had a child, and so that's the other incredible sea change in my life that has definitely made writing harder. That said, I do think that it has been really nice amid the pandemic to have a fictional universe to sink into, one that does not include COVID. Staying so far away from reality in that one.
Yeah, I can fully imagine. For writers who it's funny that you mentioned Clubhouse. On Clubhouse, I've been, mostly, I'm sure that everybody already knows about Clubhouse, this social media app where you get to poke into various rooms, and where conversations are being moderated by almost kind of these citizen moderators. It's just, I think, been shut down by the Chinese government, at least within China, for its very free flowing conversations on pretty sensitive subjects. But when I was browsing through multiple rooms, there was so much conversation about. I mean, I was listening to Chinese Americans and Chinese talk about their identity and talk about how they conceive of themselves in relation to their parents and also to the country from which their parents immigrated from. And it was very edifying for me to hear from Chinese Americans and how their identity is pretty rooted in being in this country, and where their parents are from is this country that they have to, whether it be Korea or China or Japan, is this place that they have to educate themselves about, and they have to almost visit it like a foreigner, like a tourist. And for Chinese, many of them students who who come to the US as abroad, they feel alienated in this different way, that sometimes despite being fluent, or semi-fluent in the language, America and Chinese Americans are still feel quite distant from them. I wonder for you, kind of in this process of writing about life in China as a Chinese American, do you feel like do you feel closer to your parents, or do you feel like actually in generating all these insights that you have had about the US, do you feel actually further away from kind of the naivete or the cultural norms that your parents grew up with? I mean, how has your relationship to your parents or China changed in the writing process?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the Bay Area, and so it was a much more Cantonese context. And by the time I went back to China, I was really the first in my family in a generation to go back. So by the time I was returning to China, and it's funny, the language of returning already is already, of course, not quite correct, but reflective of, I think, some of the emotional attachment that I was raised around. My parents gave me a Chinese name. We attended bilingual school. It was a huge part of our upbringing, despite the fact that no one in my family had gone back for a generation. And it was, for me, becoming acquainted with the country really was just, it was a shock. I mean, in so many ways, I feel like, yes, the writing of the book and my time in China has brought me closer to China, but it's a different China. I mean, it's pulls apart from what my parents, grew up hearing stories about. I remember first arriving in Beijing and looking for the kind of hutong courtyard home that my grandmother had grown up in. And of course, all of that had been razed. And my first experience there really was like a sense of loss and dislocation, and trying to reconcile what I was seeing in front of me in contemporary China with the sorts of stories that I had been raised around. And so much of my experience in the country was having to shelve that sense of attachment and some of those what I had been raised around, to embrace and try and understand what really fundamentally is such a different country at this point. And of course, being a journalist was really helpful in that way, and in as much as it allowed me, and my job was trying to just pay attention and understand the country, and talk to people. And yes, the writing of the book too, of course, has been part of that. And I think so much of what I hope comes through for readers is China, again, from a distance, it is a place that can feel dark and bleak, and people think of 1984. And I think for many people, who are here tonight, friends from Beijing, the lived experience can be so different, right? There's so much humor and beauty and joy also in day-to-day life that, that felt important to me to capture, and so much a part of the, in addition to all of the contradictions and all the complexities and the politics as well, there's this other very human side. And so, I don't know if that answered your question, but I think it definitely is. It's been a process of getting to feel closer to the country, but yes, in a different way, because the country has so much changed.
No, I think that accords kind of with my impression as well, of returning to China, in kind of a very different capacity than the person that I was there, than the citizen I was there as a child. I realized as the moderator, I've made two fatal mistakes. One is that I didn't invite to read from the book. I think as I think I was supposed to do. So I've deprived all of you listeners of her reading passage from the book. So I wanted to see if that was still. I mean, I'm totally open to that to doing that. I was just so excited to jump into the conversation. And less time to ask the questions as possible. And two, I wanted to I wondered if this was the time to open it up to the audience and see and let listeners get a shot kind of at asking questions. So I wondered if right. So should I okay. Tipping, do you want to read these questions or should I read them out to you?
Sure. Let me, whatever. Do you want to read them?
Oh, sure. Okay. So here, this is a question from, wow, there are a good number. Okay, here's an easy one from Vivian Golden. Have you had any reactions from the Chinese government about your stories?
No. So short answer. It's not been translated. We nothing at this point. I don't know what I would expect to. They're not known for being terribly communicative. That's a great question. I can
and here's another question from Donna. Are there locations or landscapes, emotional, social, actual places that you had in mind but eventually omitted from this collection of stories? How did you whittle it down to these choices?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, there were definitely locales and details that were omitted. As I started writing, I wrote a story or like half a story about an elderly man living in a home that was being haunted by all these ghosts from his past, people he knew. They weren't malicious, they weren't scary, but they were just like these uninvited house guests and they kept sticking around. I wrote one story inspired by a trip to Western China about a Tibetan sky burial that ended up having these surrealist elements and a love story, which ended up getting cut. And then I wrote one about a really contagious disease. Yeah, it was called the China syndrome.
You hadn't eliminated that one at this point.
I know. I really should have kept that one in the collection. I did not know COVID was going to happen. That one was, I had a lot of fun writing that story, and even more fun probably looking back at it recently. I opened it up just out of curiosity, and there's all these details that sound familiar. It's like about all the people wearing masks and the way the economy shuts down and how everyone starts like order apps like have a heyday and anyway. So there were lots that I started to write, and some that had traction and some that did not. And there were two things that were hardest about writing the book. One was knowing which stories were any good. Because this was all like me in my head, like sitting on my couch in Beijing, like reading and writing and just, it's not like journalism where you can send your work to an editor and they tell you whether or not they can, it felt like a much lonelier process in many ways and harder in that way. And so that's why it has been so gratifying just to hear all the feedback from readers. And then the other part that has been difficult, of course, is having the book come out and having to talk about it. But so plenty that got written and then winnowed out, and some that maybe will be revisited down the line.
I mean, this is a related question from Warren Wright. He asks, many of your stories are about yearning or wishing for something unrealistic. An airplane, a pen, party membership, a happy visit to China stocks. Does this reflect the people who you saw in China trying to negotiate generational and social differences?
I was just saying hi to Diana, who I'm very excited to see, who's in Hong Kong. So sorry, I totally missed that question. Let me click on the little tab. Many of this, does this reflect people who sound trying to negotiate? Yeah, the sense of yearning. Something that I remember a friend saying when I was in China was that it's the one place where you can genuinely time travel. You start in a city like Beijing, and then you travel to a village where things feel like they haven't changed in like 5 decades, and then you go to a second tier city, and it's this like interstitial weirdness of being stuck in the 80s. And I feel like so much of the experience of living there is just being so cognizant of those gaps, right? And by extension, yeah, that feeling of longing, which comes across in many of the stories, and it could be attached to an object or a person. And I think that's something that, of course, is true not just in China, but also, no matter where we are, coveting. In the case of Land in Big Numbers, perhaps your customer's expensive pen or someone's relationship, or what have you. But fundamentally, I think no matter where we are, yeah, we end up projecting our love and longing onto both objects and people, and says a lot about who we are, and often, as in the case of China, about the country more broadly too.
Yeah, and I think the second part of that question was, how do you use death or suicide to create the atmosphere for your stories?
The deaths that happened in the stories was accidental. I didn't mean to kill anyone. They just sometimes dead people appear. No, yeah, I mean, it really was. So much of the writing of these stories was kind of that like feeling of swimming through the dark towards light, not necessarily knowing where you were going, but trusting the destination. And so, you mentioned death. I'm thinking of Shanghai Murmur, where the story readers meet a young woman who works at a flower shop in Shanghai, and the man who lives several flights above her in the sort of squatter's home has died. And it's funny that you asked that question, because it really was the sort of detail that I wrote, and really I didn't even really notice it until in the revision process, trying to go backwards and figure out, okay, where does the story start? What is the story about? And then locating that moment and realizing, okay, this is where the tension is. And I do think in different places in the book, it was the same thing, right? Often you don't necessarily insert something with the sense of deliberation, but it's in going backwards that you see the significances. And when it comes to death and violence and the ways they appear in the stories, I think in that case, it was a way of creating that contrast, right, between the sense of beauty and aspiration of the one character, and on the other hand, sort of death and decay of these rotting flowers, and some of the disappointment for dreams in Shanghai. But in other places, the violence that comes up in the stories is it's from the state. It's from things also that are just, again, kind of, if you're going to write about modern China, it's very, you can't write around that.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of which, I think someone asked, will there be a translation of this book into Chinese, or is that a decision that hasn't been made yet?
I know it's something that we would love to happen. So far, there have been editions planned in the UK, coming out on March 5th with Scribner, and then one with Aufbau in Germany coming out next year, but no Chinese publisher yet.
And then from Diana, I'm curious to know what's next for you. What short stories, a novel? Like, I guess for the fans, what can they expect next?
I am working on a novel, and it is it's one that's not set in China. So stay tuned.
Great. I'm just scrolling and making sure that we have gotten. From Sophie here. Is there any element of journalism that you struggle with or find challenging that doesn't exist in writing fiction?
The struggles in journalism that aren't inherent in writing fiction.
Yeah, I guess is there any way in which journalism is harder than fiction? I guess is what I'm understanding that question.
I mean, in a China context, of course, being a journalist is hard. Jiayang can say plenty about too. Just you're working in a context where people speaking to you can be very dangerous, and so that is its own challenge, and that's way harder than writing fiction. And I guess that's my answer. Yeah.
I think we've gotten through most of the questions here. I guess I'll just end with a question of a last question of my own, and it pertains to when can we expect the novel, for those of us who are eagerly anticipating, and do you think that you said that it's not set in China. Do you feel like going forth you will be writing across a wide range of subjects that have nothing to do with China, or is it not something that you've thought about much at all?
Yeah, no, these are really good questions. Novel, date TBD. Subject matter, it's hard. I don't know. I don't know if this is something you think about too, just in terms of, like China is a topic that I know about well, and
yeah. No, I mean, I realize. I mean, it's when I'm asked that question, as I sometimes am. I also sometimes find it difficult to answer. I guess I don't know if this is the same for you, but I guess I mean, like being Chinese American, just feel like that feels a part of my identity that I cannot help. So like the way that I see myself just as a human being is filtered through kind of being straddling these two cultures. And there are questions that I kind of constantly circle back to that has to do with, with my familiarity with these two cultures. And I guess in being a writer, you're kind of always trying to answer questions about yourself. And I guess if I were, born with different, in different circumstances, with a different race, my questions might be might be different. Do you think that you will be journalism is something that you will always kind of be doing alongside fiction writing, or is that also a TBD?
I think so. I love journalism. I mean, I'm just someone who always would be, at a party, the person who would awkwardly corner someone and just want to ask them a million questions. Getting to do it professionally is a real boon. I also just think I'm someone who really readily can sink into my head and just get really lost in some ways in fiction and writing and books. And so journalism is absolutely something that keeps me tethered. And so, yeah, I mean, and I do think the two work in tandem in so many ways. The discipline of one, I think does fuel the other, and both of them, it's always, I always think back to Carlos Fuentes. It's one of my favorite quotes. Extreme attention is the creative faculty and its condition is love. And that's true of journalism, so much of journalism, and what went into the writing of Land of Big Numbers was just paying really close attention, and that's something that I feel like is true to both journalism and fiction.
And we see the fruit of that kind of on every page of this terrific book. And I think on that note, we might conclude this session. Oh yes.
Hi. Wonderful. So that's a wrap on our presentation. Thank you again to our guests and to everyone who tuned in this evening. We greatly appreciate everyone's time and your support of independent bookstores. Purchase a copy of Land of Big Numbers by clicking on the green button below your viewer screen. We're also accepting donations on our website. If you'd like to sign up for regular events, please make sure to follow us on Crowdcast and subscribe to our newsletter. Have a great evening and stay safe, everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you.